He was a couple of weeks out of his last treatment for cancer, out of chemotherapy. So he's lost most of his hair. He's looking definitely less vibrant than he maybe was a year or two ago. And he just owns it, stands up there and from his heart apologizes to the team, tells them that they've had to make these difficult decisions, commits to doing what they can to make and push it forward, doesn't skite about all the things the company's doing, like creating hotel rooms for frontline workers, doesn't talk about their furloughs versus retrenchments and the differences, just flat out owns how difficult this is. And I compare what Arne Sorensen did at Marriott with what Travis van der Zanden did at Bird. And maybe the same week, it's about 4 weeks ago, you might have seen, a little over 4 weeks ago now, you might have seen Bird laid off 405 people over a one-way, non-video, audio-only Zoom call. And so you can imagine how long the reputational impact of the way Bird delivered that message versus the way Marriott delivered there is going to be. You can do serious damage to your reputation right now. Here in Colorado, where I'm based, the CEO of Chartered Communications, which is a very large telecommunications and network infrastructure business here, right up until the end of March, were insisting that their teams keep coming into work because they were, quote unquote, an essential service, even though he admitted in the internal communications that people could quite easily do their jobs at home. Like, you don't want to be, Thomas Rutledge was the CEO, and I have no problem calling him out right now. You don't want to be Thomas. You don't want to be Travis in this situation. You want to be Arne. And so be really clear and careful about the reputational elements of what you're doing right now. If you're postponing an event, if you're pushing something out, if you're making difficult decisions, how matters. If you're in a senior role and you're in charge of maybe distribution, or maybe you use for content-based marketing and bringing in your leads, and it's a sales generating, lead generating activity, brand is the other big piece that we know from crises. I don't know if you've seen any of this data, but the research between the global financial crisis and the beginning of the COVID-19 issue showed a 317% premium for strong brands in terms of the economic return. Now, these were mostly publicly listed companies, so it's the way we're measuring their return is in enterprise value. But the point is pretty simple. Brands really do matter. And the better you behave now, the more likely you are going to be able to seize and, quote unquote, exploit the opportunities that the turnaround brings. I'll give you a quick example of that. I think about Unilever. On the 1st of January 2009, now don't forget Lehman Brothers, and Bear Stearns were collapsing and all the issues that were going on at that time. And just following that, 1st of January 2009, Paul Polman takes the CEO job of Unilever. And on the very first day he takes the job, at the beginning of that crisis, he says, quote unquote, to the shareholders, "I do not work for you, I work for the community. And if we want to create sustainable value, then we have to make a difference in their lives. We have to have a sustainable impact on the planet." Now, I actually watched him interviewed a couple of years ago, and someone said, "Why on earth did you have enough courage to say that on your very first day?" And he said, "My theory was no one gets fired on their first day in the job, but I bet you we probably pushed that pretty clearly." But his point was simply this: it mattered how Unilever behaved then. And now fast forward to COVID-19 here in 2020, and although they've got a new CEO, Alan Jope, a Scottish gentleman, used to lead the Asian business for Unilever, he's making just as good community and brand related decisions as Paul Polman was back in the day. They donated $100 million worth of sanitizer and bleach and cleaning products for the absolute most critical sites. My favorite thing that Unilever have done is they've changed their payment terms. So when they order from a supplier, instead of making the supplier wait 90 or 120 days to get their money, they're paying them right away up to the value of 500 million euro. They've basically done that because they know cash flow is king right now. They have given complimentary moisturizers out to all frontline workers because of the hand sanitizer and the masks and the impact and damage that does to skin. And if you haven't seen their campaign, That Courage is Beautiful, please do, because it follows on, it's actually specifically Dove, which is one of the Unilever brands, talking about how beautiful, how powerful, how impactful it is when people are doing good things for their world, good things for their community. So 317% premium. And by the way, if you're sitting there and you're like, I'm not in charge of accounts payable, accounts receivable, we're not as big as Unilever, we can't run a Dove campaign, ask yourself the question, what could you do from a reputational perspective? One of my favorite things and favorite bits of communication I've been getting from companies over the last couple of months. Instead of the, dear valued customer, we're doing everything we can to keep you safe and healthy. I've been getting an email once a week from Moncler, which is like the ridiculously high-end kind of weather jackets. And I'm not even like a highly valued customer, but their CEO, their CTO, their head of brand every week are curating a isolation playlist on Spotify, and they're sending out the Spotify link. And it's been amazing to watch my own attitudes towards that brand evolve and improve over that time. And so let me just kind of sum up where we're starting this conversation. A crisis is a crisis. Let's not pretend this is easy. When we're faced with the reality, and the sooner we face the reality, the better, you're really left with two choices. Number one, you can either choose to have a problem with it, or you can choose to be intentionally optimistic about it. And I'm going to break down deeply in the rest of this session what you should do with that optimism. And then the second part is to understand that how matters, and the decisions you make now will echo long into the future. Now, what does a crisis really mean? And by the way, feel free to fire. I've got my laptop down here in front of me as well. Feel free to fire any questions you might have into the chat function. I'd love to sort of real time, as we have this conversation, respond to the sorts of things that you're putting out there if you have questions. But what does a crisis really mean for a business, for an organization, for an individual leading a part of a business, right? It's really just acute change and disruption with an overarchingly negative outcome. I mean, that's really, it's just compressed, high impact, high intensity change. And a couple of things, we've been in the change business for 20 years, right? And a couple of things we've learned over the years as we worked in this space is that the destructive impact of disruption is directly proportionate to your level of resistance to the change that that disruption brings. I'm going to say that one more time. The destructive impact of disruption is proportionate to your level of resistance to the change itself. 20 years, dozens of countries, many large companies, small, medium. We've only ever seen 3 responses to change and disruption. Response number 1, lay in the corner, in the fetal position, sucking your thumb, making small mewing sounds and hoping it all just goes away. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that response. Any of you with kids who are homeschooling right now, you probably once a day find yourself in the corner. And here's the deal. It's totally okay to have those moments of helplessness. Just don't live there, all right? Second response to change is you see what's going on. You're beginning to project and maybe even predict how certain trends are going to play out. You understand the timing of the comeback of meetings and events perhaps, or when you'll be able to make sales calls, or the size and structure of your team, whether they can work on and in your workplace or from home. You're beginning to craft your view of that. But when you see it, you just think we're going back to the way things were. Or worse, you just nod your head, pretend you understand what's happening, but you have no plan to really adapt and change the way you do what you do. We call that the passive aggressive response to change. If you're married, you're probably very familiar with the passive aggressive response to basically anything, right? So that's the second thing. Now, by the way, I'd rather you in the corner sucking your thumb, making small mewing sounds, because at least I know you need help. It's the passive aggressive stuff that you really got to worry about, which leaves us the third and final response. The world's changing, so must I. And instead of hoping that after COVID-19 that we just go back to the way things were, you accept the fact that they are in fact going to change, that many trends have in fact become compressed. And our job is not to go back, but our job is to move forward. And that's the frame I really want you thinking about today, is what is it going to take to move forward? And I want you thinking through a couple of lenses, right? You could, one, think about it intrinsically. Now, I know your Instagram feed is probably overwhelmed with things like, take this moment to question your values and understand how and why you do what you do. But in all seriousness, the intrinsic opportunities are real. It's not our focus of today, but ask yourself the question, on a personal level, how can I make this crisis the best thing that's ever happened to me? Now, I know that's can be an insensitive way to say something, given how many people are struggling right now, given how many people have lost loved ones. But seriously, you have a choice of getting into a hole or building a constructive and positive attitude. If you're going to go the up way, ask yourself, how do I make this the best thing? I tell you what, for me, I have been traveling 200,000 miles a year for about 16 years, and this is the longest time I've ever spent in one place in my life. The opportunity to build rhythm, to connect with my kids in new ways, is a moment and a thing I will cherish for the rest of my life. And I'm choosing to focus on those things, and I'd encourage you to do the same. But on an extrinsic level, here is what we're finding useful with our clients. For most industries, there isn't a lot of short-term silver lining. In other words, there's not any crazy good market opportunities out there that you have to jump on. For about 15% of industries and businesses there is, but for the vast majority, they're actually really struggling. But there are things that you can do in the short term that position you well to seize opportunity over the medium to long term. I want to give you an example, but we're going like 3 crises ago. We're going 3 recessions back, right? Progressive car insurance, one of my favorite examples of innovation of all time, right? They were the 13th largest property casualty insurer in America. Their specialty was at risk, or the non-normal, non-typical insured market. And State Farm declared that they were going to go deep and aggressively into Progressive's territory at the 1991 recession, and that they were going to do it by cutting prices across the board. And so Progressive have a bunch of crisis meetings about what they're going to do, how they're going to out-innovate this massive company, which was top 3 insurer at the time. And Progressive has a different business model. Progressive makes money on the difference between the premium they collect and the payments they pay out, whereas some of the larger insurers at the time were making a loss. In other words, they paid out more money than they were getting premium and making their money investing that on the short-term money market, long-term, medium-term interest rates, et cetera. So totally different business. So they're like really at a price disadvantage as these large carriers came in to take over their space. Anyway, long story short, they run a bunch of what we would now call like an innovation jam, or maybe you call it a hackathon or something like that, where they got all their people in a room, not all of them, but like cross sections of the organization, and started brainstorming big ideas. Like, what are the breakthroughs in insurance? What could they do as a business to really position themselves on the other side of the downturn to grow market share, grow profitability? And everyone's throwing their ideas around, bit of this, bit of that. Technology was starting to emerge. And this kid in accounts payable, of all the parts of the business to come up with the groundbreaking idea, this kid in accounts payable puts his hand up in the innovation environment and says, hey, I've got an idea. And he stands up, and in front of a group of 75, 80 of his peers, he shares with them that he believes they should stop assuming everybody that makes a claim is guilty until proven innocent, but rather assume they're innocent until proven guilty. Or put a slightly different way, he suggested that Progressive would be better off to basically pay everybody that makes a claim and do away with all the investigations, do away with all the claims management stuff. Just for a second, I want you to imagine you're in a property and casualty insurance company. How do you think that suggestion went down? We're just going to pay everybody that makes a claim. I mean, I wasn't in the meeting, but I interviewed an executive who ran the innovation sessions, and he told me that they kicked the kid from accounts payable out of the meeting, told him to take a few minutes on his own because of how kind of provocative that idea was. Now, I don't know how much he was exaggerating in the interview I did with him, but he said they literally, after the kid left, begun a conversation about whether something at home had happened that was affecting his current mental health, that was impacting his performance at work. That's how crazy an idea this was. Anyway, he comes back the next day. It's a 2-half-day program. Comes back the next day and he has a spreadsheet. Now, if you don't know anything about insurance and finance, the bigger the spreadsheet, the more credibility you have. And he was able to show in his spreadsheet that over the 5 years leading up to the recession, that Progressive had spent more money on lawyers alone than they had saved by not having to pay out fraudulent claims, more money paying the lawyers to investigate claims that later proved to be perfectly legitimate than they spent on saved on fraudulent claims. In other words, they would have been more profitable if they literally just paid everyone that made a claim. Now, that conversation fundamentally changed the paradigm inside of Progressive, and now I would argue the industry, where they said, you know what, it should be easy for people to make a claim. It should be a good customer experience, and we should assume they're innocent unless it's clearly obvious there's an issue. By the way, $1 in $5 of overhead is tied up in the claims management process in P&C insurance. So by reversing this trend, they were able to extract almost 1/5 of overhead out of this business. Now, here's the deal. It led to a cascade of a whole bunch of other innovations. They were now able, if you were trusting people, unless clearly something was wrong, you don't need to put them through a 2-week process, just write them a check on the spot. So the claims assessors had the ability to do that. Then the next innovation came when the mobile modem. So they were the first, Progressive were the first company to put mobile modems in those, remember those white Ford Escapes with the word Progressive down the side? They were loaded up with 56K Motorola modems that connected the field team out there assessing accidents back to the thing. So you can happen on the accident side. They went one step further. If you are an insured, you might have an accelerometer in your car that came from Progressive, right? That tells them how rapidly accelerate, how late you brake, and do you drive between the hours of 12 a.m. and 4 a.m., which by the way is the magic 3 for calculating risk. But it also tells them if you're in an accident before you do. So God forbid you had an accident. You know, it's not too bad, but you're bleeding. You've called 911, you're waiting for the paramedic to arrive, but before they do, there are real documented cases of the Progressive claims assessor beating law enforcement and paramedics to the accident side, to which they show up and say, hey, sorry about your head, but here's a check to replace your vehicle. A mind-blowing customer experience that, by the way, is way cheaper to deliver. Now, I know it was a pretty long example to give you, but the origin of that massive cascading multi-decade set of innovations was in the middle of a recession, in a brainstorming session by a young kid in accounts payable who happened to notice an anomaly that he didn't think made any sense and decided to have a point of view and have the courage to step up and share that message inside of his company. So there's a couple of insights that come out of that example, right? Number one is there is a unique opportunity to have new conversations when we're in a period like this, not just internally like the Progressive example is, but externally as well. Two, the best ideas are still based on the fundamentals. Like he was improving the customer experience and improving the cost base of the business. They are basic fundamentals. So there's a lot being written right now about how companies like General Motors, who just about 2 weeks ago shipped their first ventilator. I don't know if you saw this, but they reoriented one of their whole factories to make ventilators. Their sales are down 50%. I really appreciate that they're doing that ventilator work, and I hope it improves their reputation. But that's not the kind of opportunity I think you should be really focused on from this point on. It was great in the first 8 weeks. Now, if you're at General Motors, you should be trying to move cars 50% down. So reputation matters, and I get that, but the best ideas and the best opportunities will be based on the fundamentals. And then the final one that comes out of that Progressive example is that good ideas can come from anyone and anywhere. And so you don't need to be a VP and above. No matter what your role, if you have a point of view, if you're seeing something, you don't need the positional authority. Even less so during a period of crisis, because we've been interviewing CEOs all around the world. We're in the trenches with them right now as they make these difficult decisions, as they reorient their organization. One of the main things we're discovering is they're distributing decision-making and distributing where the work gets done closer to the customer. And as a result of that, these people have a uniquely different set of permissions than maybe they had prior to COVID-19 crisis to come up with ideas and to drive the business forward. So there's something unique that happens in a period like this, new conversations. Two, focus on the fundamentals about driving your business forward, because the novelty is not going to move the needle. And remember that good ideas can come from anyone in anywhere, irrespective of positional authority. And I would argue in the pandemic-related environment we're in, this distributed decision-making and distributed ideation out towards the marketplace is a very good idea indeed. So let's back up. So we're talking about finding opportunity in crisis. We're not denying, however, how difficult a crisis can be. I've made the suggestion that you, one, be intentionally optimistic, but two, that you pay attention to how you make decisions, because your reputation does indeed matter. However, I made the point that your level of resistance to the change that the crisis brings will have a proportionately negative, in other words, positive in the case of the curve, impact on just how bad the crisis turns out to be. In other words, your willingness to roll with it, to adapt, to be resilient, and to adopt new practices is part of how you find opportunity. In other words, focus on moving forward, not going back. But be aware that you'll be making short-term bets for a long-term gain, as per the Progressive example, but that it can come from anyone and anywhere. And so you might have noticed in the link in the chat, and by the way, you guys are super active on chat. I can see just myself being overwhelmed here with all your participation. I'm just kidding. Maybe if you're from one company, we'd have a few breakouts right now. A few Zoom room breakouts would be good. But so what are the windows? What is it about a crisis that presents a unique chance and opportunity to find both intrinsic and extrinsic opportunities for you and the business. There's really three things, and this is on that canvas that I think it might have been Sheahan uploaded into the chat feature. Number one is that your stakeholders have a different level of appetite and a different openness to adapt and willingness to adapt now relative to other periods. Two, there seems to be a breakdown or a breaking of some more traditional aversions to risk in businesses, as well as an acceptance that it's going to be a really tough year, so it may as well be a little tougher and we can make a few bets. And then three, there is an opportunity for a whole new set of ideas and imagination driving those ideas and assumptions as a result of what's going on. So let me break these three, we can call these the three lenses to the window of opportunity. Let's start with stakeholder appetite and willingness to adapt. And by the way, just as I pause, because I can talk at this page for a long time, if you've got any ideas that are coming to your mind around what you're seeing an emerging appetite for, plug them into the chat. Let's have a look at them. I'd love to see if you're seeing this in your various different industries. But here's what I reckon is happening. Number one, all bets feel like they're off. In the first month of this crisis, we facilitated multiple strategic planning days for senior executives, many of them very mature, white males, right? I'm just being really blunt, right? And all of them you can't possibly do this stuff on a Zoom call. Yeah, you can. We're running live polls. We're doing breakout rooms, having conversations, 4-hour meetings, none of this 45-minute limitation stuff. And with the chairman of one of the largest companies in Canada said, quote, that was even better than if it had been face-to-face. Now their mindset is completely open to what's possible in terms of how they might interact. Think about what we do with events. I mean, it feels like people have a genuine willingness to engage with different tech and to experience it in a new way. That's a good thing. That's like breaking old biases. I saw a couple of really good examples of that. I saw there's a greeting card company I like called The Thoughtful Human. But not many people were going to shops early in COVID and handwriting cards and sending them in the mail. And if they were getting Lysol before they made it into the house, right? And so Thoughtful Human, the card company, partnered up with a bunch of mass scale therapeutic platforms where you have on-demand access for mental health issues, etc. And instead of gifting someone a card, you could give them an hour of therapy. And given 30+ million people lost their job, it's not a bad thing. I don't think prior to the crisis, the consumer market would have thought of Thoughtful Human as being able to play in that space, but they have extended their brand and done so successfully. You're seeing the emergence of cloud kitchens, these really high-end restaurants that are doing home meal services, not just takeout, but I mean a 5-day meal plan stuff. And so all bets are off a little bit. So ask yourself in your industry, in your business, what sort of sacred cows have kind of been broken down? And if you want to jump a few of these in the chats, that can be fun too. I think the second part of this stakeholder piece is that there seems to be a stronger appetite for even engaging in this. I don't reckon if we'd run a webinar on a Friday 10 weeks ago, you'd get 100 people, or however, I'm not sure the numbers here today, but one of my companies in Australia, it's a technology company we work with schools, partnered up with a gentleman called Dr. Adam Fraser and ran a seminar that 24,000 people showed up to online. 24,000, that's not an error. If we had run that 10 weeks ago, maybe we would have got 200 people to go to that. It was on student well-being in an isolated environment, so it was super timely. It was the right stuff. We had a lot of data, a really good value prop, but 24,000 people showed up in this environment. That would not have happened before. It's like we have permission to do different things. And then the third part of this stakeholder appetite, the first box, the first lens, is the importance of customer intimacy in an environment like this. Of all those CEO interviews I was telling you about, and by the way, if you want to get some of those, I can send a few through to Premier. We have a number of interviews with very senior executives about how they're managing the crisis. Happy to get that content to the Premier team for you and your leaders. But the number one finding from that research is that CEOs said the biggest mistake they'd made in previous crises that they weren't going to repeat this time was they weren't close enough to their customers in previous recessions, previous downturns, previous crises. And that customer intimacy and the importance of monitoring demand signals was the single most important thing for determining whether they extracted serious opportunity from the crisis or not. I know we've got a question come through here, and I'm going to jump onto that question here in a minute. But let me just finish this point around customer intimacy, right? In the global financial crisis, the last recession we had, the number one reason people left their financial advisors in one of the worst financial markets ever was a lack of communication and a lack of intimacy. That's the number one reason. Not market performance, not access to cheaper funds or cheaper fees. The number one issue was a lack of communication. Ray Dalio, speaking of investment, founder of Bridgewater, says the most important thing in a difficult time is to bet against consensus and be right. Well, the only way you know how to bet against consensus to be a little bit earlier is if you are super in tune with that marketplace. Are you having these regular conversations? Are you touching base more often rather than less often, even if you're worried about getting bad news from that stakeholder? Because in our experience, they're more willing and more open to that chat than maybe they previously were. So that's the first lane, stakeholder appetite and willingness to adapt. Let me just check this question here and make sure I'm giving it some attention. What shifts have you seen event owners make that have raised the effectiveness of online gatherings? This is a pretty good question. I might do that in more detail at the end, but it is a good example. So we're seeing, for instance, event companies who used to try and stream their events. It's probably the best example to that question. Who used to stream their events by just basically trying to replicate what was happening in the convention center, in the trade show, and just put it online. And I think what they've started to realize is they need a much, much more curated experience in the digital environment than they were doing in the offline environment. So some of them are still hosting, bringing physical people into studios, etc., but thinking about it more like a TV show than they are just a live streamed event, for instance. There's an awesome webinar that I facilitated. Well, I shouldn't say it was awesome. I think it was pretty good. There's a great webinar that I facilitated for PCMA with Sheriff, the CEO of PCMA, the head of global events for Microsoft, and the CEO of Maritz Global Events, which is one of the largest event companies in the world. And we go for a whole hour answering that question. So I can also send that link through the Premier team for that question. I may even able to give it to you directly. I'll get you a copy of that link so you can watch that. I think Don might have had a question here too. Yeah, right. Don's saying, if you can share what sacred cows is your company looking at differently? What are the most innovative ideas you've seen in other companies? Don, I assume that's a question. Is that a question for everybody else, or is it a question for me? Because if it's a question for me, I'm going to come back to it in the Q&A. Let me get through these last two lenses so we can get to that open discussion piece, right? So here's just one last point around this unique crisis environment. That stakeholder appetite and that willingness to adapt will be short-lived. I'm going to say that again. The window will close. I'll give you an example. How long do you think, following 9/11, how long do you think it took for commercial air travel to return to its previous peak? And remember, go back to the emotional state, not just of the US, but of the world after 9/11. Nobody was talking about flying again for a very long time. But there is a concept in behavioral economics called the projection bias. And what projection bias means is we tend to overestimate how long our current emotional state will persist. The answer to the question was under 3 years. It took less than 3 years for commercial air travel to return to its previous peak after 9/11. Just consider that for a second. I think many industries will begin to snap back unless they look for this to drive the innovation forward. So if you are seeing things that you want to hold on to, if you are seeing things that you want to push forward and innovate with, make sure you double down on those opportunities now, because this window will close. I know there's been two great questions. I'm going to answer the question related to customer intimacy really quickly now, but the other couple I'm going to get to at the end of the session. Someone asked for another example of customer intimacy. There's a great company out of Texas called ComFit, COMMFIT. And what they basically do is create turnkey fitness solutions for multifamily housing environments, for hotels, for workplaces. Pretty bad business to be in the middle of COVID-19. And so instead of just going quiet and not wanting to get any more of the bad news from their clients, they've been on the phone, calling them, Zooming them, having brainstorming sessions with these clients about what will a gym look like coming back. They have found that there is a strong appetite for buying new equipment, for changing the way it's set up, for altering the level of service and support. They're finding that as soon as we reopen these gyms in these like apartment complexes, they're going to want more regular cleaning, not less regular cleaning. They've even gone so far. So they've had all these really unique and beautiful conversations at ComFit. And by the way, we have a video with the CEO of ComFit too that I can get to the Premier guys as well. I'll make sure you get all these links, right? They have started asking, what are our competitors doing? And they've found for the first time their customers willing to give them all the market intel. as well. So it's a really simple practice. It's called calling your clients, asking them what their problem is. And I'm going to get to questions here in a minute about what questions to ask that client and yourself, more like it, and just following it on and, taking the window of opportunity while you have it. All right, that's the first lens. Really quickly, I'm going to do the other two lenses here quickly. What's been holding back ideas for you in your business? When you think about your boss and who you've been trying to drive innovation through, what do you think's been kind of holding you back over the last couple of years? I bet you it's things like don't fix what ain't broke. I bet you most of your businesses have suffered just a small bit at least to what we call the gravity of success, where you don't want to go and ruin the great formula. Well, you know what? The boat's been rocked, things are broken, and now you can maybe take some risks that you weren't otherwise able to take. We are seeing a really interesting thing, by the way, and I don't know if this is true for all of you, and I bet you some of you are watching your budget pretty tightly right now. However, we are seeing the beginning of an attitude emerge, which says something like this. It's going to be a really bad year anyway. We may as well take a few extra smart risks because the impact on our reputation is not going to be much worse, or on our share price is not going to be much worse, even if we have a slightly worse quarter than we expected. In other words, the belief that the market is pricing in, although I think the market right now is pricing in the comeback rather than the difficulty. But I'll give you a good example. So I'm the COO of a second-tier market casino company. And so gaming machines, restaurants, accommodation, tough business to be in right now. He said they made a really intentional decision, it's a publicly listed company, not a big company, but it's publicly listed, to not fire anyone, but to furlough everybody and let them maintain their benefits. Because in both of their second-tier markets that they operate in, they've been struggling to find talent. I'm like, wow, dude, that's a pretty expensive decision. And the COO said, yeah, but it's nothing like as expensive as it's going to be to rehire all those people and to find them, not to mention will now be seen as the employer of choice. He said, I'd rather write down a bigger loss in this short-term environment and position myself for success in the long-term environment. And so there is this emergence of this risk aversion and sunk costs. That's the second lens. And the third lens, and I'm going to kind of wrap this up here pretty quick, is that what an opportunity for you to begin to use your imagination, to question assumptions, to think about things differently. And, the example, the answer to the question about how event companies are doing this is a great example. I've seen in my own business pivots in certain directions around new customer needs that we wouldn't have done otherwise. And so don't be a victim to the environment. In it is emerging new possibilities, and with it comes a once in a decade opportunity to question assumptions. And so I want to move the conversation forward, and I want to make sure we've got time for Q&A. So I'm going to just make two more points here. One is around what is the most important job for a leader during this period? And then number two is what are the questions that every organization should ask themselves? But I just want to check the webinar questions here and just make sure I haven't missed anything too serious here, right? Brian Elliott, great question. How should B2B sales teams handle calls? Yeah, Laura, I'm sure we can get you this webinar for your C-suite for sure. Yes, Laura, I love your comment here. 50 years of business, we've always done it this way, right? This is the perfect window of opportunity for you, to begin to push the lens, push the belief a little bit. I don't have any platform. I actually do have some platforms I'd probably suggest. I'm not sure I should do that publicly in case I'm wrong, but maybe offline we can send you a few ideas of the ones we've worked on that have been pretty good for the digital stuff. I'm not a digital event specialist, right? We work with CEOs to accelerate transformation. That's my expertise. But I've had some pretty bad, I've been on some pretty bad platforms and some pretty good ones. So we might be able to get you an answer to that question. Let me wrap my session up here and get back to Brian and do a little bit of Q&A here. Number one role of a leader during this period is to create as much psychological safety as you can. If you want to understand psychological safety, it's the belief in that an individual has that he or she will not be criticized, shamed, or emotionally humiliated if they make a mistake or do the wrong thing. It's a feeling that people have that makes them feel comfortable to take a risk. Okay, I'll give you a quick example. When Alan Mulally took over Ford, a couple of years before the global financial crisis, mind you, he went to his first leadership team meeting, and every single person in that meeting was reporting green on every single priority they had. Everyone was green. And Mulally says to the group, he's like, we've been going out of business for 17 years, literally losing billions of dollars. How can you all be green on your priorities? And he pushed and pushed and pushed over a couple of months. And finally they came clean and said, look, we used to get accosted or yelled at or humiliated for making a mistake, and we wouldn't dare do that publicly. So Mullally asked them to trust him that if they made a mistake, they wouldn't get reprimanded for it, they would get supported. And Mark Field, who later became the CEO, by the way, was the first executive in a meeting to report something other than green. And shock horror, Mullally responds not by abusing him or yelling at him, but by going around the room with the other executives and goes, who's got some ideas that could support Mark and his efforts? And then all of a sudden, people realized that they were there to work as a leadership team, not as a group of individuals that come together and report. And that's what we call psychological safety. I'll give you another super quick example. We used to do a lot of work with Microsoft, who, by the way, I think are doing incredible things right now under Satya Nadella's leadership, just a phenomenal return to growth story and treating people very well in this downturn. I really have my hats off to Microsoft. And it's not just because we've done a lot of work for them over the years. I think it's an incredible business. But I remember back in the day when Steve Ballmer was running Microsoft, they used to have a quarterly review system. And I remember talking to some of the executives that reported up to the CEO. I said, what do you call it? And they said, we call it hammer time, as in hammer time. And I'm like, what do you mean it's called hammer time? They're like, yeah, that's when we go to Steve's office and get hammered. That was how safe they felt reporting on their progress at the time. By the way, Microsoft shares jumped 11% the day Steve Ballmer stepped aside and Satya Nadella took the job, and he doubled the enterprise value of a Fortune 5 company in under 5 years. And I promise you, the fundamental difference is not Microsoft, their skills, or their market position. It's the level of psychological safety Satya provides for that team. Now, two really important things for a crisis. Number one, lying to your staff does not create psychological safety. Don't say things like your jobs are safe if they're not. You should be honest that it's a difficult time and there's a lot of uncertainty, and we have to learn to live with that. That'll build way more psychological safety than not. Two, the more transparency and honesty and the higher cadence of communication, the better. Much more than pre-crisis levels, because anxiety is the fastest spreading emotional affect inside of corporations and cultures. It will spread like wildfire. So your job is psychological safety. So final point, and I've included this in your canvas as well, right? There are a series of 6 questions. Actually, I've cheated by putting a couple in each, but a series of 6 questions that not your homework, but the take home, the go do, the action item after this webinar conversation that I'd encourage you to get your team together. I don't care if you're a small event team inside of a business. I don't care if you are the CEO. These are your questions. And if you're answering them from a team perspective, answer them from your team, not from a company perspective. If you're an individual contributor, answer them from your role as an individual contributor, not from a company perspective. Question number 1, what problem do you actually solve? What do you actually do? And if you say something like, well, we put on events. No. Why do you put on events? What do they do? Are they connecting customers to buyers or customers to sellers? Are they connecting industry people? Is it creating political action? Is it get really clear what the actual purpose of what you do is? Not the purpose so much, but what's the outcome as well, all right? So what problem do you actually solve? 2, how is that problem changing now? And what new problems are emerging as a result of COVID? 3rd question, go to our 3 lenses. What permission, appetite, and emerging possibilities now exist that can evolve the way you solve that primary problem? 4th question, what existing assets and capabilities have you got that position you to solve these new problems? In other words, what skills, how are you already well positioned to solve them? What additional assets and capabilities will you need to develop in order to be able to be effective in that way? And then the 6th and final question is, how will your team and organization need to evolve in order to be successful in this new space? Those are the 6 questions that if we were doing, so the person who wanted this for their C-suite, they're the 6 questions we would ask the C-suite. How do you get through these? Because that's where you're going to find the opportunity. So that short-term investment for the long-term gain based on the short window of opportunity that emerges in a crisis, these are the questions that I would be seeking to answer. So Brian, I'm about to hand back to you in about 30 seconds, mate. Let me just do a quick summary. Let's not pretend things are all rosy and Pollyanna. They're not. Crises are really tough. Own that, accept that reality, and lean into it. There are absolutely opportunities to be found here. There are unique windows created when we have a recession, or a crisis and likely a recession, right? And it requires, one, that you're intentionally optimistic, and number two, that you pay attention to how you do things, not just what you do. And there are three particular reasons why those windows emerge. One is this idea of all bets being off, this idea that we have a different level of permission, a different level of appetite than we maybe normally would have with our stakeholders. The second is this idea that there's risks that we used to not want to approach that we maybe would be prepared to approach given how bad things have been and the sunk cost. And then the third is that there are new assumptions and beliefs now that lead to greater levels of imagination that can solve that window. But just remember, the window doesn't stay open forever. And if you don't know where to start by asking the primary questions. There's 6 that are there for you. But don't bother asking any if you don't create a safe place for your team to contribute an answer, because they'll just keep it to themselves. So hey, to the Premier guys, look, we could talk about this stuff for 7 days. I know I've gone pretty hard, pretty fast there. Try to make it, relevant no matter what levels you are or what size of organization you've got, but happy to dive into some of these questions now as well. And I don't know, Brian, I think we're going to co-facilitate this bit, right? I'm just going to grab my laptop with the chat feature on it as well here.
Yeah, definitely. No, thanks for doing that. Thanks for sharing everything. Yeah, and so one of the questions that came up here, can you give more examples of creating intimacy with customers during this time when the demand for our product is low?
Yeah, so that is an interesting, I'm assuming it's hard to know exactly what industry you're talking about when the demand is low, but if the demand for your product is low, then there's probably a different level of capacity happening at the buyer level as well. And so I'm going to share a personal example. Early in the crisis, in the speaking business, most of the work we do is through bureaus with great partners. In fact, all of our work is through great partners like Premier. And rather than try and shove product down our partner's throat, we just asked ourselves the question, what's the most valuable thing we can do? And it was to bring up to the minute data, up to the minute insight, and facilitate conversations that weren't otherwise going to happen. So that was a personal example of how we drove a different level of customer intimacy. I'll give you a second example. One of our clients is a very large property development company here in North America. And they were struggling. They didn't have a demand issue so much, although actually demand was affected because people weren't exactly buying houses in the last 2 months. The real issue was they couldn't get in a room with their buyer. So this actually relates a little bit to the B2B question that was asked as well. And so they asked themselves, could you do a virtual showing of a house? And they'd been mucking around with this idea for about a year. In the space of 3 weeks, they stood up an entire virtual methodology for how their salespeople would take someone through a home, the different talking scripts, how they would take 3D virtual tours, match it with photos, and a live Zoom style experience. And they're now moving inventory that they wouldn't thought of being moving previously by meeting the customer where they're at. And so I think maybe the answer to that, Brian, is where is your customer at and how do you meet them there rather than try and drag them towards you? And if they're not buying what you're selling right now, what are they seeking? What value do they need? What are their emerging problems? Question number 2. And how could you lean into those? That would be a couple of examples that I would share.
Great. One of the other ones, how should a B2B sales team handle sales calls to clients who are prohibited from conducting business?
That might be classified as an impossible question. It's one of the questions I'm like, well, what B2B business and what does forbidden from conducting business really mean? So I'm not sure entirely how to answer that question. Are they forbidden from doing business altogether? Meaning, are they allowed to talk and ideate? What perfect example? The Confit example is an example of that. You're not allowed in any of those multifamily gyms. So they're not actually allowed to do, those gyms in these multifamily environments and hotels, you're not allowed to be in there. But everyone who runs the resident experience inside of those environments or the guest experience is asking themselves the question, how do I maintain that post-COVID-19? So maybe for a B2B person, ask yourself the question, what are the major concerns that are likely on your B2B customer's mind right now about what will and won't be possible when they're no longer forbidden to do business? Because I promise you, they're thinking about those today, not in a week, 2, 3, 4 weeks. And have your conversations about that. Because I promise you that stuff's genuinely front of mind for these guys right now. I I don't know. I'm kind of stitching that together without more information. So I apologize if that doesn't nail the question.
You know, that's Brian, you're high level. You're high level right there.
You know, my issue is I normally want a 300-page briefing to understand the industry before I answer a question like that. That's the problem with speakers. We think we know the answer to everything. I'm like, well, I don't know about that one. Give me more information.
Yeah, and for those listening, you know, Peter does do a ton of research. He's got a whole team on it. So last question here. How much do you balance short-term and long-term goals right now?
Yeah. Oh, you know what? You know what I think we should do? So I deliberately didn't focus on that for today. We are doing a lot of work right now with senior teams around what decisions they need to be making right now, what plans they should be building right now, and then what things they should be thinking about that are much longer term right now. So it's plan, it's act, plan, so act, plan, think, right? In 3 key categories. We could send you maybe a link to a webinar. If I can send you a link, I've got a whole model on how to do that. But here's basically the key principles. But I want to find a way to get your clients some more value in that area, Brian. Firstly is this. In order to make the most of the opportunities that come out of a crisis, you have to survive the crisis, okay? You've got to be here in 6 to 12 months. And so the decisions you should be making now around short term should be around protecting your cash burn and maximizing your capacity. That's number 1. Number 2, you should be beginning to have the conversations about how it might play out. No one has a clue what the actual economic return will look like. But when you break it down by industry, you can actually make some pretty good predictions of what will and won't be likely. Not the topic of today's presentation, by the way, but my view on what's happening is that the trends are just getting compressed. I don't see too many radical new trends emerging. I see the compression of trends that already existed. So you could take that and begin to engage in really constructive conversations about how it might play out. Now, you're still acting and protecting your short term and your capacity and your ability to survive. And if you're inside a big company, ensuring you continue to add value so you maintain your role and you maintain your job and you maintain your authority. But you should be now beginning to lay the groundwork for these bigger picture things. However, do not orient your team's entire energy towards this space, right? Because most people are doing their best just to keep up with what's going on out there, to deal with less than full factories, to reschedule events from offline to online. Like, there's so much going on. You do not want to overwhelm and burn people out. And so you only want to be having the conversations about this stuff right now, not making huge investments. So act to make sure you're here, survive, and do the basics. Begin the scenario planning and the thinking stuff that we need to do now, but don't reallocate all your assets and resources to opportunity exploitation when you still have to crush the first stuff to begin with.
All right. And actually, I got the okay to ask one more question for you here, and then we'll wrap it up. So this is from an event planner in the financial business. Our customers are community banks, and most are in rural America. Their bank customers and employees are close to them, most family members, church members, etc. Our customers are so overwhelmed with fear. I think a lot of it's based on physical location. How can we continue to be an amazing provider to them, but help them overcome fear?
Yeah, such an interesting question. We have done a lot of work with, we've done a bit of work with large groups of community banks, but a lot of work with credit unions particularly that believe member intimacy is the core part of their value proposition. Let's go back to these assumptions and imagination. I think we have forced upon a demographic that may not have otherwise migrated towards more digital connectivity. I think we have forced upon them a rapid adoption curve. And I don't see any reason why in those rural communities we can't maintain a level of connectivity anyway. We're seeing it in agriculture, in primary industries across the board. And so this is not outside the realm of possibility for financial services in those communities. So number 1 is don't think you can't use the tech. People are moving towards it. 2, divide and conquer a little bit. Take your customer list and have your tellers or your planners or your managers, whatever, if you're in financial advice versus retail banking there, have them make 10 extra calls a week. I mean, if you can, or a day, if you're not overwhelmed by trying to figure out phone processes and the SBA loans and stuff like that, and give the responsibility out to them to reach out. You'd be surprised how much you can sort of calm people's nerves about the solidarity of your brand in their life, or in a bank's case, your long-term likelihood to survive and continue to be able to meet their needs, especially when you've got their savings, et cetera, or if you're given financial advice, their market value too, you'd be surprised what you can do in an hour. Go back to this example from Canada where they studied financial services companies and people leaving their primary relationship, particularly in advice. Communication was the #1 issue. So if you are not actively reaching out to quell those fears and to calm that group down, then don't expect them to do it on their own.
That's a great answer. Well, Peter, thank you for taking part in this. For everyone out there, thank you for tuning in to Premier's Free Virtual Friday. Next week, we have coming up Damon John from Shark Tank. We'll be doing a more of like a fireside chat Q&A, so we'll definitely need some more questions here. So once again, Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
You're
and
welcome.
Thanks for everyone for tuning in.